Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Marlo Pedroso. Marlo is a licensed independent clinical social worker with over 15 years of experience as a therapist, facilitator, and organizer. He specializes in integrative work using evidence-based approaches like somatic focusing, psychedelic-assisted therapy, and internal family systems. As a queer child of immigrants, Marlo brings a unique perspective to his work and is passionate about supporting men and transforming masculinity. He provides ketamine-assisted therapy and has developed innovative approaches like ecotherapy that integrate nature into healing. Marlo is dedicated to helping men move beyond isolation and develop authentic purpose and connection. Marlo, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be with you, Wes.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. So I'm curious, I'd like to start with hearing your story. You've dedicated a pretty big part of your career to supporting men in transforming masculinity. I'm curious if you could tell us more about your experience as a man through the lens of being raised in an immigrant family and being queer.
Well, like you're saying, my parents immigrated here from Portugal, and I think that deeply informed my identity formation in the sense that I always felt like I lived between two cultures, not being fully American or fully Portuguese. But my father came from a culture where it was pretty traditional, pretty patriarchal. Men definitely had the status, the dominant role in the family, a lot of very traditional values, some of them quite positive and healthy, prioritizing family, being there, but some of them also quite limiting, kind of was domineering, had some challenges with alcohol use. And so, that was there for me from the start, developmental trauma, focusing somewhat on my own healing and my own challenges with depression, anxiety. And I think my path was one of working on my own healing and eventually recognizing that some of my own challenges actually gave me a certain level of empathy, compassion, and sensitivity that made me a good candidate to help others. And I felt an increased motivation to do that. I've always been really curious about other people, but I've learned a lot on my own journey, both through personal work, and also then through my studies, my education, and then my experience as a therapist. And I think in a lot of the work that I do emerged out of my own healing journey and really seeing that I had work to do in regards to my relationship to my own sense of masculinity and to other men. I really needed to, I think, learn to appreciate and accept the positive qualities there and also learn to work through some of my fears and my own maybe limited view of other men. And through that, I got involved with some groups of men, did some men's work, some of it more formal, some of it more kind of DIY, where men who felt similarly, who also had a kind of feminist perspective, who really understood that dominant notions of masculinity were limiting and constraining. We came together to really look at some of those patterns to support each other. And I think that really radically shifted my own understanding of what it means to be a man, what the potentials are there that can be unlocked. And that drove my desire to do more work with men. I was already attracting a lot of men. I mean, you probably have this experience as a male therapist. There's not that many of us. So a
That's
lot of
right.
men come knocking at your door, right? They want that perspective or that understanding. So, and I was seeing a lot of myself in my clients. And so I just really started to lean into that, learn more about that, and offer that. And it's been a really rich journey and important part of my work.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And resonates. I'm married to my wife who comes from more of an immigrant family and similar experiences that she had growing up, it seems like you did. And I find a lot of men are still there. And the reason why I ask, I think it's really important to have someone like yourself like represent experience. And I think because a lot of people I work with that come from immigrant families experience what you're saying of this like bi identity thing where they're like, yeah, in some ways I love my family. I couldn't be more known by them. We're very cohesive and we're close. We've been through so much together. And at the same time, they don't tend to get me at all. And then especially on the masculine side of things, it's well, my father taught me these things which were really healthy, like you're saying, very balanced approach. Obviously, you've done the work because you have very redemptive language to it, which I appreciate. And you're able to honestly critique and call out what was unhealthy and unhelpful. And I'm just curious for a guy who may be coming from that type of world where he doesn't know much about therapy, he comes from that type of family, but yet he senses this desire to both include his past and his traditions while transcending them. Some tips or things to think about.
For me, it was really some of it was good fortune, but some of it, I think, was a sense always that there was more that was possible. And good fortune in the sense of being drawn to other people who had similar experiences and were asking questions, not taking things for granted, kind of challenging these dominant frameworks and, um, you know, seeking the community that kind of helps you think through that. I had a lot of really amazing female partners who were feminists who really showed me my own limitations, helped me see where I really needed to grow and learn. But I also had the good fortune to connect to social activists, people who were trying to change things in terms of systemic racism, class inequality, other social movements. So that was a big part of my formation in college. But I do think that it's the notion that we really heal in community. What I encourage a lot of men to do is to find community or to really lean on the friendships that they already might have and to take risks, to go deeper, to be a bit more vulnerable, to be more curious. Because what I've learned over time and working with men is given the opportunity, men are really wanting that and they're really hungry for it. They're often afraid to be the first one to go. And sadly, I don't think we exist in contexts that are often feel safe enough or encouraging enough for men to do that. But I think we just have to be courageous enough to be willing to go first sometimes. And also to seek out like-minded communities. I mean, we live in a very fortunate age in some ways where it's easier to find other folks who are thinking about these questions and asking similar questions than it ever was. So I think that's one of the benefits. I think one of the challenges there is that technology can also create distance and get in the way of those more meaningful personal connections. So we have to be sort of mindful of that and lean into it. And that could be uncomfortable for men because especially it's changing, but I think our father's generation uh, wasn't really being educated on a lot of the skills that are needed to navigate relationships at that depth.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning the community aspect. And it's something I was going to touch on part of your story as well, that it wasn't just that you did the hard work of healing, which is admirable in and of itself, but you had the wisdom to know you needed to find others around you to support and be supported by. And it seems like you're saying it's so powerful and necessary to find people that you can relate to in your experience, whether that's from a sexual orientation perspective, from an ethnicity perspective, from a gender perspective, from, socioeconomic perspective, just any sort of touch point that you can relate to. at the same time, not limiting yourself to connecting solely based on those categories. And it seems like when men gather in groups, you get a really beautiful balance of feeling known and seen, but also having different experiences show up and be represented that really help you expand your own view of masculinity, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah, I think you summed it up really well. And just to add to that, you mentioned the sexuality, the being queer piece, and that was another really big community. And I think in some ways, because I already didn't feel like I fit in to the dominant narrative, being from an immigrant family, working class roots, being queer, it almost forced me in a way, in a good way, to have to seek out my people. Because just by the nature of who I was, I already didn't fit into the standard dominant masculine notion of a traditional masculinity. And finding tribe was so radical. It kind of, it was a radical expansion of what was possible for me. So yeah, just adding that piece, really important.
I'm glad you mentioned that. What it brings up for me is I have a client here where we're both in Massachusetts who comes from a traditional immigrant Italian family, and he's gay as well. And he really struggles to know how to express himself with mainly his father, and we're working on a lot of that interpersonal effectiveness. But I'm just curious for anyone out there who may fall into that category of wanting some guidance and understanding of how to step into the full authenticity of who you are, as you've done, but in a way that you realize you're tethered to these relationships that you have to engage in. And obviously, it's painful, it's complex, it's can be confusing for both people involved. But yeah, I would just be curious any guidance or wisdom you could offer of someone who may find themselves in that position and how to navigate those relationships, especially with a father from that kind of culture.
Obviously, we may be biased, but I do think it's great that your client has you, to be mirrored by someone, to be seen, to be respected and accepted. I think it forms the basis, the confidence, the self-love that I think is required in order to have those more assertive conversations, especially in the context of a parent-child relationship, because it's so complex. And I love the adage, like, your parents are able to push your buttons because they created them, or your family. And I think it's so true. That's the doctoral level of work. And you can't start there often, especially, I mean, it depends on the family context. If you have a parent who is willing to try to meet you, to reckon with it, who at least is open to it and shows a desire to understand, even if, they have a long way to go. I think that's a very different situation than, if you have a parent who's just very closed minded, or who is almost harmful in the way that they see you. You have some families who are conservative Christians, for example, who, there's can be a way that it's actually harmful to try to engage in those conversations. And there needs to be healthy boundaries that are set up. But I think if there's an openness, yeah, I think, first of all, having people who have your back, so that when you have those difficult conversations, and if they don't go well, or if you inevitably you'll need some space to process, just knowing that you have people to go to support you in that process, because it is a process, right? It's not going to be one interaction. It's going to be an ongoing process. And for me, honestly, I know there are certain areas that I I don't think my dad just has that capacity, for example, to understand, to meet me. Like, the gap is so wide. And it's been a process, but a process that involved setting some boundaries and also accepting that he is where he is, and he is able to show up and love me in his kind of narrow way, maybe not to the in the full way that I would want him to, specifically on a more emotional level, but to be able to see that, okay, he does love me in his own way. He does show up for me. And, sometimes that's the best that you can get too. So preparing yourself for that is important. And the last thing I'll say is sometimes what's really important is for you to be able to say your piece. And if you can go into those conversations with the understanding that your father, your parent, might not respond in the way that you want, but it's still important that you are using your voice, that you are expressing yourself on what's important. I think that can be really empowering, even if you don't get the sort of closure or the desired response.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. Feels very helpful, and especially that word capacity strikes me. And I think your experience of longing for an emotional connection and bond with your father is, I would almost dare to say, universally shared by almost all men in our generations and younger. And there is this dissonance where you feel like, wow, okay, I have all this access and understanding to mental health, and partnership looks different if you're in a heteronormative relationship, or and allocating responsibilities that traditionally would have been disproportional. And there's a lot of healthy standards that are being raised for men, and yet at the same time they're interacting with their fathers that tend to fall well short of that standard. And I think your ability to see that their capacity can be disappointing at first. I know certainly for me, I've had these sense of like, wow, gosh, like, is this okay? This is what it is. And coming to terms with that and accepting it can be tough. But I think what you're getting at there is it saves a lot of frustration and disappointment that realistically isn't helpful and isn't contributing to the relationship in a way that progresses it. And instead saying, okay, I'm going to accept it. Now, by no means is that enabling it, which I think people can confuse and conflate. Like, hey, it's you're certainly not condoning that narrow capacity you mentioned is acceptable from a general standard point. But at the same time, they are where they are. Where else can they be? Just like the rest of us. And your ability to engage with them on that place, I think, will give you more inner peace. And I think actually help you more accurately set the boundaries that you need to, instead of having this idealistic standard, being perpetually disappointed, and then having trouble knowing where to set the boundary.
That's well put. Yeah. A piece of that too that can't be overlooked, I think, often precedes or arises in parallel to the acceptance is grief. You often have to grieve the parent that maybe that you had hoped for or maybe even deserved, a parent who was good enough, not perfect. And there's a loss in that, that longing is in there. And I think coming to terms with that loss, sometimes we think of loss of having something and then losing it. But I think there's a kind of loss that can come from never having this thing that was so essential, and that I think can leave this void in us that only through grieving that can we really fully accept it. That was certainly true for me, and I find that that's true for many of the clients I work with.
Yeah, I think that's right. I appreciate you naming that. And it's something many of us men struggle with, how to grieve, allowing ourselves to grieve, feeling worthy of grieving, feeling the necessity to grieve. But I do agree. I think that the loss is a felt sense that is just as real as someone passing away that you care about, because in a sense, the potential of who that person is and the connection you have with them is dying. And that can be tough to wrap your head around, but I agree. I think you're really grieving the value and the depth of what you may never reach, which certainly, thank God, as you said, given our current society, can be made up for in some ways. But as you well know, the father figure is a uniquely irreplaceable role that one person plays in your life. And I think to some degree it has to be grieved, and it can't be supplemented through other things, though at the same time not giving it power to bind you, to say, okay, because I don't have this with this person, then I can't have it with anyone else, or life can't be the same. But I think it's complicated.
No, that's right. And I think the process of healing entails finding the balance between reparenting ourselves, right? Learning how to give ourselves the things that, parent or parents or caregiver wasn't able to. And also learning how to ask for that from friends and partners and to be open enough to receive it, because there can be a lot of things that arise in those more dysfunctional dynamics that make trust really hard, make vulnerability really hard, um, that foster this almost unhealthy type of self-reliance that's extreme and can cut you off from healthy interdependence. So I think you're right. It's not. It can be healed, and we can find other ways to kind of supplement that to go on to live and flourish in holistic ways, for sure.
Yeah. And on that note of the self reliance, that is a traditional masculine expectation. And men seem to be caught between these expectations and the evolving cultural narratives about what it means to be a man. You mentioned that outdated norms lead men to struggle in isolation. How do you help men navigate this tension while developing their own authentic sense of masculine identity?
Yeah. Well, I always tell men that even just reaching out to me is a courageous step. Not just men, obviously, it's a courageous step for anyone. And I believe that. And that to me shows that within each of us, there is a desire to heal, to live in, to access our vitality. Let me put it that way. And I from that, from having hopefully some reparative experiences, from having a container in which men could show up fully as themselves, to really start to become more embodied. That's a big part of my work, and to connect to their emotional life, which is so rich, and it's there always, even if we're not conscious of it. But when we're not conscious of it, it can run the show in the ways that are maladaptive. But once we start to become more conscious of that, we can start to relate to it, to work with it. And I think from there can be a more openness to start to invest in relationships rather than feel like I have to do it all alone. It's not safe to rely on other people. To rely on other people means I'm deficient or weak in some way. Um, and I think those notions are often, ironically, even more pronounced. And people come from minority groups, because they're already encountering all of these views that are denigrating them for being of a certain race or sexual orientation, um, or not being native born Americans. There's often, I think it comes from safety, desire for safety often, in addition to those messages that you should be able to do it. So that starts to slowly get unraveled. And I think I often share my own experiences in that work. And I think to be able to do any good work with clients, you have to be willing to be vulnerable with them. It can't be a one-way process. So modeling becomes very central in that process as well. And I have a long way to go, of course. I'm still unraveling, but I've done a lot of good work and I've had a lot of good models. So I think there's something there that I offer.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned the complex perspectives that maybe minority men tend to have from a resistance to share standpoint, understandably, of not feeling safe. And as we both know, the therapy world, especially, can be white dominated and yeah, just very middle to upper class dominated. And I have found working with clients that don't fall into that box, there tends to be an understandable apprehension. And also, those cultures don't necessarily normalize therapy like middle to upper class white culture does. And I'm curious if you could speak to, yeah, that in any form of just why you think that is, or how we maybe can provide helpful mental health support to those communities, that deserve it and need it. But obviously, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle because a lot of times, well, what's the need for therapy? why would I spend my money on that? That's if you're crazy. The common tropes, or people from a Maslow's hierarchy of needs standpoint, they're really just they have severe trauma, or they're struggling in any capacity. They're just trying to get by. They're not necessarily trying to unpack things or reflect. I'm just curious if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, I pay close attention to those factors that go beyond, I think, was the traditional focus of Western psychotherapy. Self, and then self in relationship often to mother, and that was seen as the primary locus of what we attend to. And fortunately, as a social worker, we're really trained to look at social dynamics, social patterns, institutions, and being really attentive to that. I really remind clients, this isn't just a you thing or your family. You're in this larger context that either is supportive of certain parts of your identity or not. And so the degree to which you're able to feel safety is really impacted by that. And I think that's key in the work that we do is naming it explicitly, and being comfortable having those conversations. Fortunately for me, I grew up in a community that was very diverse, racially, ethnically, lots of immigrants. So that comes pretty natural to me, having those kinds of conversations. I actually find them fascinating and rich, and they really support the work. And I think when people are given the permission to talk about those things and name them, it actually really helps often undo a lot of shame and self judgment. People put so much weight on themselves. We live, especially in the US, I think there's this emphasis on like optimization and self help. And, if you can do the right kinds of exercise and take the right kinds of supplements, you can overcome and flourish. And it's not to say that there's nothing in that. There are good things about that. But again, it reinforces that idea that it's really up to you to pull yourself up by your bootstrap um, mentality. I really work with that. I really try to bring that in. Uh, one of my teachers and mentors um, did a lot of work with liberation philosophy from Latin America and bringing that in to the therapeutic environment and kind of challenging the dominant notions of what therapy is in Western society. And I think that has been really helpful in giving me a framework for person in context and really always paying attention to that.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. It brings up a good point of needing to name the uncomfortable truths we find that we live in that can often feel fearful to name, because you think, well, who am I? Or I don't want to experience rejection or dissonance with this person. But it sounds like our ability in a healthy way exudes some sort of assertiveness and directness by sometimes just respectfully calling things how they are actually lets everyone's guard down and says, finally, we can kind of all acknowledge it, but then not stay here. What does it look like, you're saying, to move forward in community? That collectivist mindset, which, to your point, is just so missing in the US. Speaking of the isolation you mentioned, this hyper individualism, I mean, people are essentially more intimate with their screens than they are with other people. And there's so many reasons for that. But you're right. I think we need to restore the in person components, the community components, and really gather together in a way that feels, yeah, healing and supportive. And speaking of relationships, relational challenges seem to be a common theme in your work with men. Curious what patterns you most observe frequently, and how do body-based approaches help men develop better relational skills and the emotional availability you mentioned earlier?
It's a common feature because, as you mentioned earlier, expectations have changed in really important ways, necessary ways. Men are being asked to do more on the domestic sphere. Men are being asked to do more emotional labor, to be in relationship with their partners in ways that have not maybe been the norm for men. And because I think men are often raised in really competitive environments and problem solving ways of relating to challenges and issues, then come to relationships with a lot of deficits. And so I tend to see two patterns that are common. One is, in the words of attachment theory, a more avoidant attachment style, where men keep a distance emotionally, where they retreat into themselves when they really struggle to hear feedback from their partners and to stay present. So big part of the work that I do with those men is doing a lot of work on emotional nervous system regulation, because I think a lot of times the avoidance comes out of a fear of intimacy, sometimes because intimacy in the past was not safe, or maybe there was a certain level of disconnection and neglect that led to men just learning to be in isolation. So the nervous system regulation, I think, allows men to feel more grounded, to be able to be more present, to not go into a spiral if their partners are, upset or angry with them or wanting to have a challenging conversation, but also to be more present and embodied so that you could take more pleasure in the connection and have more joy. Because that's the other thing, the stoicism often leads to a kind of gray sort of life. It's like you have a few emotions here and there, but you don't have the full spectrum. So that's one side of it. I could say a lot more about that, of course. The other side is a kind of people pleasing, fawning approach where there's almost a lack of assertiveness and this relating to partners from a very complacent or compliant place. And I think that can be just as detrimental to the relationship. In working with people who are in relationships with men, they often describe wanting a partner who they could feel, who's there with them, who's a real person and an equal. And I think it's frustrating to be with men who are like this. So for a lot of those men, it's learning that conflict and challenging conversations are not a bad thing. It's learning to help them tap into their own desires, to be assertive without being aggressive, and to not equate those two things. I think a lot of those men are reacting almost to authoritarian or domineering fathers. And they're like, I don't want to be like that. And that was certainly true for me for a lot of time. But I went so far to that extreme that I often was abandoning myself and my own needs and relationships. And eventually the relationship would deteriorate as a result. So I really had to learn that balance of being receptive, but also being assertive and kind of having standards for what I'm needing and wanting in order to have a satisfying relationship. I think that's what our partners want. And I think that's what's required in a healthy partnership.
That's such a helpful framework, and I agree. I know it's been called nice guy syndrome, and a lot of men struggle with that. And I think the symptomology and how one arrives there is helpful to hear from you, especially given your personal experience with that. And on the flip side, with the emotional granularity and being able to communicate emotions, being body based, I'm curious, that's something a lot of men struggle with. I mean, including myself, I find often, I process from the neck up. And like you said, emotions are so powerful, and much of the emotional expression is nonverbal and is happening on that somatic level. Curious if you could give us some guidance for a guy who wants to learn how to express himself emotionally, what somatic signs he can pay attention to and start focusing on, and any tips and some first steps in how to express himself from an emotional standpoint.
Yes, guilty as charged too. I definitely tend to go up here. It's often safer up here,
Yes.
or more comfortable, and our culture certainly is pushing us more and more that direction. When I work with men who are especially disconnected from emotions, I often start with sensations. Just tell me what physical sensations you're experiencing. Don't try to name the emotion yet, because that's often an easier starting point. Some of us just don't even have the vocabulary, or we don't know how to match certain physiological somatic experiences with the emotions. And often emotions are complicated. For some people, it takes a while to really get at them. We process them slower. I think that's often true for men who, again, haven't had a lot of that experience over the course of their lives. So I encourage men to start there. To Yeah, I think it can be really helpful to develop practices like mindfulness, where you aren't just paying attention to your thoughts, but also paying attention to what's happening in your body and kind of connecting the mind body. I think in terms of relationship, I often encourage what I've heard called the sacred pause, which is before you react, take a breath, just pause. You don't have to respond immediately. And I think that's often there's a pressure that men feel to know, to be on the ready. And then the other thing is helping men see that often what's wanted from them is not a solution or a problem. It's really just their presence. And in order to be fully present, you do have to be in your body. Sort of, I'll often even just say, okay, feel your feet on the ground. Connect to the earth. The earth will hold you, and it is holding you. And so, really kind of get there. And then the other sort of somatic cue that I often encourage men to do is pay attention to your back body. Joan Halifax, a Zen teacher, talks about, strong back, open, soft front. And I think that can be a real helpful, just somatic cue, because we're so often focused on our presentation. Our persona is kind of from the Greek word, like a mask that we wear, and our egos are often associated with that. But I think when we can kind of lean back and then lean down into connection with the earth, that can be a good place to just begin. It's a process. It's like anything. It takes practice, it takes time, and it pays off so much. The other thing is, for a lot of men, I think physical exercise and activity can be really helpful, whether it's a sport, running, lifting. If you can really start to do that and pay close attention to what's happening in your body, I think that's a good entry point for a lot of men. That can be a real positive. I think anything that requires mindfulness of alignment, posture, especially, which I think most sports and athletic endeavors do. So those are some ideas.
Yeah, those are great. And what just came to mind, I never thought about the symbolism of, strong back, soft front. And I think we were talking about the stoic archetype or role that many men tend to play. It's the opposite. Like you're saying, a lot of times we show this very hard, protective front, but there's a lot of unhealed insecurities and chaos that is soft that's behind us in our back. And it seems like our ability as men to almost allow ourselves to switch those and to start to practice things that give us a strong back, a foundation, something to protect us, like you said earlier, to make us feel safe, but yet live with this open heart and open mind to those around us. I think that's pretty critical. And speaking of alternative modalities that aren't often mentioned, your work includes ketamine assisted therapy and your training in other psychedelic modalities. Curious what you're seeing as the way that's showing up. If you've worked with any men in that space, some common maybe barriers men are facing being in there in that type of treatment, and maybe some common breakthroughs that you're finding as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of promise and potential in that work, some peril as well. But the promising sides of it is that a lot of these various psychedelics, one of the things that they do is take us beyond the normal levels of consciousness, whether personal or even collective. They allow us to see often through a lot of those, outside of those. And so that can be confusing, and that can be disorienting, and that can be liberating. Often it's all of those things, but it's a kind of to, uh, a good trouble as, oh my God, I'm forgetting his name. Maybe was it John Lewis?
Yes. The activist from Atlanta, yes.
That's right. And it's troubling in a good way because it's disrupting our default mode, the habits that become so ingrained, the conditioning, things that may have been adaptive in the past but have become constricting and maladaptive. So with psychedelics, I think it facilitates through neuroplasticity and this ability to access these different ways of being, of seeing, and the work after is of translating that into practice, into behavior as well. And that's where integration is so important. So, there's all the three stages of that work is preparing the actual psychedelic session and then integration. And I've seen a lot of powerful change that may have been happening already in the context of therapy, but there could be these roadblocks where there's such a fear or resistance to change. One of my uh, peers talks about certain psychedelics as kind of oven mitts for picking up emotions that feel too hot to pick up normally. It's like it gives you this ability to, like, okay, I can do this, I can be with this. And I think that also makes space for processing things that were very traumatic or harmful that keep us locked in that fear. So that those are some of the ways that I personally seen that be healing. I've also seen it be incredibly powerful in group contexts. That's a big part of what I do too. But I think with the use of those medicines in an appropriate setting and container, I think it can really deepen men's ability to be vulnerable, to be in relationship with each other, and new ways to explore more without the same fears or hangups. And so as a tool, when used skillful, I think it can really offer new models and ways of being in community, and where men are healing each other and showing up for each other. I mean, I think that's true even without psychedelics in the group work that I've done, but there's something, again, about the medicines that can really support that, encourage that.
That insight's very powerful. I'm really struck by the testimony that you've brought in such a grounded recollection of it. I think it can often be flashy and people, use it as shortcuts, but I think your focus on the integration and breaking it down into three stages is so important, but really naming that integration piece is where the work is done. I like to say that during those sessions, the things come to the surface, not because when they come to the surface, that means they're healed. Then you have to deal with them because now you're aware of them. And that's when the work starts. And, that community, going back to it, it applies in every single context for healing for men and male bonding of going through such a vulnerable and real and transcendental experience. And yet, I imagine when you're processing it as a man, it feels so grounded and real, sometimes realer than the life you live in a way, in a strange paradoxical sense. And having that space to share, I imagine it shortcuts a lot of that mental barrier that both you and I have struggled with, and many men use as that protective front that we've been mentioning. And it bypasses in a really beautiful and subtle manner, let's say, that just kind of says, okay, there you are, but I'm just going to slip past and we're going to get to the heart of this and allow you to really see things for what they are with the goal of working it out in the sobriety of the integration.
Yeah, that's essential. And another thing that I think is really powerful in those experiences is the spiritual level that I think there's also a deep hunger and thirst for, but also a disenchantment with the institutions, the religious institutions that many of us grew up in for good reason. Psychedelics often get us in touch with some sense of the divine or some hunger for deeper meaning and purpose and something that's way beyond our individual selves, that the sense of interdependence, but also the sense of being right sized, a certain humility, which can be refreshing because we're often, and we're like the main protagonist in our own movies. And when we go beyond that, it puts things in proportion as well and helps us see that in a way, this is all just a a short trip that we're here. It's precious, but we don't have time to waste, and we're not really doing this on our own. We can't actually just do this on our own because we're woven into the fabric of reality. So having access to that, like you're saying, it doesn't fix everything. It doesn't magically make everything better. There's no shortcut. But being in touch with that essence, I think, is so powerful because even if you lose touch with it on occasion, once you've delved into it and it's there, it really gives you a certain faith and confidence to keep going. And I've seen that, heard that from a lot of people. That's been my experience as well. So it's another dimension I wanted to bring in.
Yeah, I'm glad you did. And such a beautiful place to land as well, which is, as a man, there's this journey of wanting to find meaning and purpose and connection with the divinely masculine and understanding who you are as a man. But it comes through a lot of hard work of healing and the support of a community and really seeking out different modalities, whether traditional or alternative, as you've mentioned today, to become the man that you are made to be and that you want to be. So thank you for exuding being a mature male today, Marlo. And I'm curious where people can find your work.
Yeah, I would say the best place is to look at my website, marlopedroso.com. I also have a Substack profile where I share some of my writings and thoughts and poems. And so please also take a look at that if you're interested.
Awesome. We'll make sure to put all that in the show notes. And thank you again. And guys, until next time.